to this Wednesday of Holy Week. Today our passage is Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13, which is the story of Jesus being anointed at Bethany. So let's read this together. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." This is a very interesting story. It is one of the beginning stories in what's known as the Passion narrative, the stories that we tell here during Holy Week. So let's recap this story. What's happening in this passage? Well, obviously there's a woman who is anointing Jesus while he is at a table at a home of a man named Simon the leper. Now, what's interesting is we know the man at which house Jesus is at, but we don't know who this woman is. In the Synoptic Gospels, we never really know her name, which is okay. But it tells an interesting story of this woman is to be remembered, as Jesus said, but we don't really know who she is. And I'll cover that in a little bit as to why that might be a little important. But it's this woman who's bringing an expensive jar of perfume to where Jesus is at, and she begins anointing him like what was common in the areas around the Mediterranean at that time. People often anointed people at festive meals, and it was seen as a luxury to some guests, which is probably why the disciples are almost outraged at it and confused as to why she's doing it. Probably the one thing that they've definitely picked up from Jesus is that we really shouldn't be wasting stuff on ourselves. We should be giving and helping the poor. And in their minds, this very expensive perfume could have been sold and that money given to the poor instead of being wasted around on just one person. And although that is true, there's something to be said here about giving to Jesus, which is probably the point of this story. Jesus tells the disciples, "Don't bother this woman. She's doing a good thing for me. She's making a sacrifice to me, preparing me for what is to come, and that's a good thing." So what's important about this text? Why are we reading it as part of the Passion narrative? It doesn't seem to have much to do with the Passion story at first glance. But in truth, it does have a lot to say. So let's break this down. I believe that there are 3 important things we can get from this short little story that we can take away for our daily lives. The first is that this story shows the importance of women in the mission of God. If you know anything about the Passion narrative, you'll know that women serve a very important role in Jesus's passion, in his leading up to his death, his actual suffering, and even his resurrection. Women are there at almost every moment, and that includes this beginning of the Passion story. Here we're seeing a woman demonstrate the proper response and reaction to Jesus telling his disciples that he's going to be dying soon. He's told his disciples many times what's going to come. He's predicted his death, he's prophesied his death, and he's claimed to them that it is according to the scriptures that this must happen. And most of his disciples, most of the men of disciples, oftentimes don't believe him. They don't understand what's happening. But in this story, there is a woman who does what is considered a proper response, whether she realizes it or not. She is preparing Jesus for his death. It's common back then for women to prepare bodies for burial. We'll even recognize this, and this is part 2, by the way. We'll realize this towards the end of the Passion story when we're getting towards Jesus' resurrection. If you remember, there's a group of women, disciples, who are on their way to Jesus' tomb with oils and perfumes. They're on their way to his tomb to prepare him for burial, to prepare his body. But they end up not doing it because Jesus has already been resurrected. But it's in this story that Jesus explains that it is because he's already been prepared. He was prepared in advance for what was going to happen by this woman here. His body was prepared for the inevitable and prophesied death that he was going to suffer. It is also, and it can be said, that this is a story, and because of this burial anointing, that is symbolic of why Jesus is called the Anointed One. If you know, the Hebrew word for the word of Messiah also is defined as Anointed One. It's what Messiah means. It's come to be used as a term solely to describe Jesus the Messiah, which means Jesus the Anointed One. To be called the Anointed One, to be anointed into something, is to be called to do something, to be chosen for something important, to be set apart for God's work. And Jesus certainly has been called to be that. He was set apart in the world to be a sacrifice for everybody, as God's Son. Here, Jesus is actually being anointed just before he is to fulfill and complete his mission here on earth, to really be the Anointed One. We see him being anointed just before he is to begin his suffering. It is in preparation of what is to come. And here in Holy Week, this is what we're talking about. We're preparing ourselves and telling the preparation story that leads up to Jesus' suffering on Good Friday and eventually his resurrection on Easter Sunday. There's one other thing about this passage that I think is important for us to take away as we're reading it. It is that this woman's gift of expensive oils, expensive perfume, serves for you and I as a model of sacrificial love. And it reminds us, just as it reminded Jesus' disciples, to use our own resources in selfless giving for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This woman gave up a great sacrifice to anoint Jesus. I know the disciples talked about how this money could have been used to give to the poor. But think about the woman. She spent an enormous amount of money for this perfume, probably saved it for a special purpose, and used it here. With or without knowing the importance and the significance of it, she demonstrated a great sacrificial love for Jesus by anointing him with such an expensive thing. She gave up her own means, her own resources, to give to Jesus, to demonstrate how much she loves him, which he did by demonstrating how much he loves for all of us a few days later. During Holy Week, I believe that it serves as a reminder for us to be called to mirror Jesus and to mirror his sacrifice in whatever ways we are called to. Jesus sacrificed himself because he loved us so much. So it only fits that, like this woman, we're able to sacrifice what we have to demonstrate our love for him, just as we would sacrifice what we have to give to those who do not. And that's something we can take away from these short little amount of verses. Thanks for joining this week. We'll see you tomorrow.